Welcome to another Monday session of Facts as we finish up our series, our small series we've done through the Gospels. We started with Mark's Gospel and the testimony of Papias. Then we jumped into Matthew's Gospel, looking at its origins from the Hebrew Aramaic language and how it was later translated into Greek. Then we followed up the Synoptics with Luke's account, and we also did a review of the Synoptics with Jonathan Sheffield. And we started last week the Gospel of John, and this week we will end the Gospel of John. And one of the things that we touched on last week that we'll jump into today is following up with why are these Gospel writers, particularly today we'll look at John, leaving their names out of their accounts. This is one of the greatest criticisms. In fact, recently I was watching a debate between a pretty renowned professor at the University of Duke debating one of our apologists, Jonathan Sheffield. And one of the things that he said in there is, why do you think they did not put their names in here? And given that I have great respect for these people and wonderful minds and great academics, I question how they could ask those kinds of questions. And we'll look at why I really struggle with that kind of a question in our session today, given the fact that these guys are tremendous historians and they understand the writings and the nature of the writings and the times that they were writing in. So we're going to jump into some of that today. And we're going to jump in. Let me bring up my screen here. And we're going to start with John and looking at why is John's name left anonymous? And for that matter, why are all of their names left anonymous? Those are things that we're going to look at. But in the upcoming events, before we jump into that, what we're going to have next week is a week off. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to jump into kind of a new mini series, but it's kind of continuing this theme of the Gospels. We're going to look at what did the Council of Nicaea do when it came to the canon, or did they do anything to the canon? Because that is the greatest, one of the greatest claims and fallacies that you hear. And by the way, not just from the atheistic world or not just from the skeptic world, but rather even in the Christian world, that Nicaea was relevant to canon. So we're going to look at that after we come back from the break. Did the Council of Nicaea choose our four Gospels? Did it choose our canon at all, particularly the four Gospels? Then we're going to jump into some of these other accounts. And I'm really excited about this. Most of my PhD work was in these gospel narratives and writings and epistles that were either Gnostic or just non-canonical. Some were heretical for sure. But looking at some of these accounts, like the Gospel of Peter, and that's actually one of my favorite. I probably spent more time. Well, I say that. I spent a lot of time on Thomas, but Peter particularly, because I wrote not only about Peter, but I translated my own translation for class, the writing or the fragment left over of the Gospel of Peter. And I'm going to make that available for you as listeners. You'll be able to click a link and read the translation that I have of the fragment of the Gospel of Peter that survived antiquity. We only have one. We have some references to it, which we'll talk about later, but we do have one ending, really, from the trial of Jesus to the death, burial, and resurrection, and then it cuts off. I did my own translation, and I'll be glad to share that with our audience. That'll be coming up as well. Thomas and all 114 sayings. We're going to talk about his account. Is it Thomas? Could it possibly be Thomas? We're going to look at him. Also, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Judas, and others. We're going to look at other writings like Peter's letter to Philip after the resurrection. We're going to look at these items and say, well, what are they teaching, and are they orthodox, and can they be traced to the apostles, and are they consistent with those that are traced to the apostles, and why were they written, and who did they influence in that timeline? So we're going to look at those as well. So that's what we have coming up. We're going to shift away from the canonical Gospels. We're going to go to the non-canonical texts, and we're going to look at them and compare them, because what we're being told is we should believe that they're all created equal. That they're all the same. They should be treated as the same. They're all historical. But when we put them side by side, we want to examine the evidence and say, you know what, is this good practice? So we're going to jump into some of that as well. Also, a couple announcements to go here. You'll notice in the beginning of the comment section, There is a new Patreon being offered for those who would like to give toward Explain. And what we're going to do, particularly on this side of the ministry, because there's many shows that are a part of Explain. You have Finding Truth with Santi, who's doing a tremendous job with interviews and even hosting debates. And then we also have Old Testament Conundrums with Jonathan Beasley and Theos with Samuel Neeson, and various other debates that are coming onto the platforms. So we have multiple outlets that you can tune into. But as far as facts goes, we have talked to the leadership of Explain. And if you are willing to give a minimum of $10 a month as a Patreon toward Explain International, I will be releasing to those individuals my weekly notes, my personal study notes, as well as what you see on the screen. I'll be sharing that with you. For those that are watching via just audio going through Spotify or Apple, one of those audio outlets that we use as well. You can find this as well on our website at explaininternational.com. You can also do so on our Facebook page and follow us and like us there. Or you can find this video on YouTube on Explain International, and you'll see the link in the comments. We would invite you to do that as well. Also, we're going to up our game a little bit. If you're willing to give them a minimum of $15 a month as a Patreon to Explain International. And by the way, this goes toward the ministry, not so much individuals in it. It goes towards getting our name out there more. We're excited about this. So just keep that in mind when you're giving toward this ministry. It's growing it internationally. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But if you'd like to also partake in one session each month, where after the fact show, I'm going to have a private conference room discussion with people who are part of the Patreons and let them ask additional questions and have this discussion time. We'll make that available for those who give a minimum of $15 a month, in addition to the notes that I will be handing out. With that being said, we want you to know what we're up to. And I don't want to take too much time here because we want to hit John's gospel, but I think this is important. We have reached quite really a large stretch of people in a short amount of time, just merging some of our ministries with City Lights ministry of apologetics, with Explain apologetics, and also Finding Truth, coming together, merging, becoming one ministry. We have reached now the area of Germany and Luxembourg, as well as places in England. In Australia has been a huge following. I was surprised to see some of the statistics come back from Spotify, particularly how many people in Australia are watching on, or listening, on Spotify. We also recently made contact and have recruited and has joined us, actually. One of our newest apprentices is in the country of Fiji, just outside of Australia, New Zealand area. And obviously we have a large stretch into the area of Malaysia and other places in Southeast Asia. We've been reaching, and in Canada there's quite a few in Canada that watch our show as well. So we really want to continue to get this out. We also have an apprentice, and I think he's in the chat down at the bottom, named Tyler, who is taking his ministry into the Turkish language. He is converted out of the Muslim faith, and he is now a follower of Christ, and he is bringing content to the Turkish language on YouTube. We also have another young guy, really good, well-spoken young man named Jack, who is in Luxembourg, who is translating a lot of our work into Arabic. He is also converted out of the Muslim faith as well, and he is doing a good job taking our written content and now our video content and producing it in the Arabic language for those that do not speak English in that area. So we're excited what the Lord's doing. So this is what you'd be joining in our efforts and doing. Also, you can privately email me at sboyce, B-O-Y-C-E, at citylightseattle.com. If you have any more questions about that, we'd love to answer those questions. All right, let's jump right into John's gospel. Let's pick up where we left off. I want to focus on one of the statements that we went through last week on the Muratorian fragment, which is late 2nd century. And one of the phrases that was made after their approach of deciding, should we write an account? In the 4th gospel, it says, is that of John, one of the disciples, when his fellow disciples and bishops entreated him. Now, remember, that was consistent with much of the testimony that John was not necessarily interested in writing an account, but those that were around him said, look, we think you should write an account. And he decided to go along with that. And he did. But this is how they did it. He said, fast ye now with me for the space of 3 days, and let us recount to each other whether what should be revealed to each of us. And on the same night, it was revealed to Andrew, one of the apostles, that's Peter's brother, that John should narrate all things in his own name as they called them to mind. Now, we're going to come back to that phrase in a minute because that's where we're going to focus on today. He says, what marvel is it then that John brings forward these several things so constantly in his epistle, also saying in his own person, what we have seen with our eyes and heard with our ears and our hands have handled, that we have written. Now, this is a direct quote, or close to a direct quote, I should say, from 1 John. So the Muratorian fragment is recognizing that the Gospel of John and 1 John are the same author, and that they are distinguished amongst the other Johns that are mentioned in Scripture because he gives us a definite that it is one of the disciples. Now, there's good argument to John the Elder being one of the disciples as well, which we're not going to get into. If you missed that in previous programs, please go back and watch that. But I think it's clear here that he's talking about the apostle because he's dealing with Andrew and others who are part of that apostolic group who are still alive during this time. But it says, for thus he professed himself to be not only the eyewitness, but also a hearer. And besides that, a historian of all the wondrous facts concerning the Lord in their order. And we talked about how John's gospel last week is far more in order than the other gospels in the sense of he calculates the first miracle and all the way through the events in comparison to, say, Mark, for example, which was not written in a particular order, as Papias has told us. So when we're looking at John here, I want to go back to that phrase in the middle, if you're looking at it on the screen, when the Lord apparently revealed to Andrew that this should be written, it says that John should narrate all the things in his own name as they called them to mind. Now, when we look at the Gospel of John, it's not in his name. Why or how is this consistent with the Muratorian fragment? Was John mentioned in his own gospel? Well, he was, but not by the name of John. So we have to ask this question. Why didn't John plainly say he was the writer? That's the first thing we're going to look at. In fact, why didn't any of them say that? Now, we talked about Luke, where that may be an exception, where it appears that his name would have been originally written on perhaps the original document, writing to a direct person like Theophilus. But John does not do that, but yet he seems to put himself into the story quite a bit, more so than Matthew ever did. That is for sure. Outside of Matthew having a high flavor of tax terminology and property transactions and giving himself an epithet, there's really not much that shows Matthean insertion into the text. Mark, you can see high levels of Petrine writings, and we talked about that in those. And if you missed those, please go back on YouTube or Spotify, listen to those and catch up in the series. Hopefully they'll be an encouragement to you as well as informative. Please leave us feedback and comments on those as well. But when we're talking about John, why didn't he just come out and say, I'm the writer, John the apostle? How hard is that, right? Most of us have no problem doing that. In fact, when we're in school and we're turning in a document, if you did not have your name on the top of the sheet, you failed the class. In fact, I remember I had a teacher in high school who was pretty strict about this. If you turn in a paper without your name on it, you were automatically flunked. You got an F. Because there's no way of associating that work with you. Even if the teacher used process of an elimination and found out you're the only one left, you still got an F in the class. And the reason for that is we want to identify the writer, identify the one that took the test. So why is it so difficult for the four Gospels to just put their names on the documents? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, this was not the practice of historians of that time. Now, let me clear this up. I'm not saying that they did not do this. I'm talking about biographies. I'm talking about the style of writing that the Gospels are in. Obviously, when you look at the epistles, writing personalized letters, you have Paul leaving his name, Peter leaving his name. You don't have that issue as much. So the question is why in the biography side of things do they not plainly state their names? Now, note this. Ancient historians, they were often using the third person when referring to themselves, when they're talking about themselves almost as an observer of the scenery that's going on. When they're watching things take place, they are writing in the third person. We see this consistent. This is not just something Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John did. Xenophon did. Polybius did this. Julius Caesar, Josephus, Lucian, and others wrote the same exact way. This is not unique to the Gospels. The historians were careful not to make biographies about themselves. Don't miss that. So not only was it not a practice of that time, you see this consistent in Greco-Roman literature, whether you're talking about Xenophon, whether you're talking about Julius Caesar, whether you're talking about Lucian or the great Jew who wrote on the wars like Josephus, whatever you want to put there, there's others as well. They were writing distinctly apart from their writings in a third person sense to give information. So that's one reason. The second reason is they were careful about not making a biography about themselves. They were careful not to include themselves and make themselves the hero of the story, to make themselves the most significant thing in the story, because it was not a writing about their own life. It's not an autobiography. It's a biography. So the question should not be, why didn't Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John just plainly put their name in there? Perhaps with the exception of Luke. But the real question should be, why did the second and third century Gospels explicitly use names? That's the real question. And this is what drew me away in the thought that Jonathan Sheffield's debate recently, and listening to that debate, I heard a very, very intelligent and kind man make the comment and question of, why do the Gospels not just say their names? And from a historical perspective, it's puzzling, because as a historian, they should know the type of literature in that time. And not only that, the question isn't why didn't they put their names? The question is, why did the other gospel accounts make clear their names? They were trying to sell you on who they were. You read the text, and I'm looking forward to walking through these texts with you as we go through Thomas and Mary and Judas and Peter. These are exciting texts to go through because they're historical. But what you'll find quickly in all of them is that they make a great emphasis to point out to you that they're Peter. I, Simon Peter, am writing these things to you. I, Thomas, I, Mary. They are very careful to let you know who they are. Why? Because they need the name recognition for validation. You see, if the churches get letters with apostolic names on them, they're more susceptible to believe them. But if they know the origin of the writer and the credible delivery of that message that is given by the hands of whoever they sent, a representative on behalf of the apostle. We see this in the epistles all the time. Certain individuals were carrying letters on behalf of Paul to go bring them to the churches in different areas. The same thing would have been true. The writer is significant. The one delivering the writing is significant. From point A to point B, the writer and the audience, to continue credibility amongst themselves, there had to be a consistent point of reference from A to B. And that includes the person delivering the note. They had to be credible and known and received by the churches as much as the name or the lack of the name thereof in the letter. It would have been improper, and at that time, they would not have utilized their names in a biographical work like the Gospels, the same way you see Paul writing to the church at Ephesus. It would have been completely different in these accounts, and it's not random. It's not something that's unique to itself. As I stated, you see this in other accounts of Roman Greco writings. And we're going to look at illustrations of this, especially with Josephus, where we should be asking the question, if their name is written in it, why is their name written in it? Are they trying to sell something because it's inconsistent with how the apostles did their work? So let's go through some things. And I like what Bauckham says. In fact, most of today's work that we're going to look at are ideas and concepts that Bauckham wrote about in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. John is his baby. John is one of his favorite ones to write about. And if you read Bauckham for any stretch of time, you'll realize that's his favorite gospel. In fact, I'm pretty sure he did his dissertation on it. But Bauckham said this in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. The use of the third person keeps the author as the author hidden behind the narrative as he or she is in the rest of the narrative. And what Bauckham is basically saying is this: the author is not making himself the primary source. The author is not making himself the point. The author is keeping himself as an author, writing about another rather than writing about himself. He's distinguishing himself in doing so. And this is a consistency we see in the early writings of that time. Another reason. So why didn't John plainly say he was a writer? Well, I mean, that's not the style of the time. It would have caused issues of discrepancy with the churches. But also another reason here is, as one person puts it, it's a direct autopsy. And what does that mean? Well, what Burskog meant by that, because this is a term that he used, this is what Burskog calls the author who is involved in the events themselves. It's not that they're saying, oh, I wasn't there, but they really were. That's not how they were handling it. It's rather they were involved, but they want to maintain a qualified, reliable source to give the information without robbing the main primary person. And in the case of the Gospels, it's Christ. So they're not robbing him of his glory, robbing him of his importance, robbing him of his story, but they're not lying about the fact that they were also there too. In fact, they place themselves within the narrative, giving themselves credibility as eyewitnesses, but also maintaining the authorship side of this to the point where they're not stealing the scene, but they're also not distancing themselves where they're no longer credible. Because after all, you want the eyewitnesses to write about the biography because they're the ones that saw, heard, and experienced all those things with that person. So how do we do that? How do we write a document where you don't make yourself the point, but you also don't remove yourself so much that you lose credibility in eyewitness category? Well, that's what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John did. They made themselves a part of the stories, gave evidence to themselves in the narratives, but did not steal the scenery away from Jesus. That's how they did that. And John was probably the best out of the four Gospels to do that. And remember, Luke would have been writing on behalf of other eyewitnesses, not himself. Mark was writing on behalf of Peter. I think we understand that if you've been following this program long enough. Now, this is a similar idea of what Josephus said about himself. This is what Josephus said: my qualifications as a historian of the war was that I had been an actor in many and an eyewitness in most of these events. And what Josephus is saying, he said, look, I look at myself and I'm writing as I'm an actor, because he was there. He was an eyewitness in most of these scenes that he was writing about. But he wrote about it in the sense of where he was also a team player along with the other components, not making himself the hero of the story, but rather somebody who was involved in seeing things happen. And he did that carefully. And it could be this is exactly what John meant in John chapter 21, verse 24. And I want to read that verse for you because we'll touch on this a couple of times today. It says, this is the disciple who testifies these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. So this is what John is saying. He's saying, the testimony I'm giving you is consistent. I'm an eyewitness. I'm writing about what I've heard and what I have seen. He's doing the same thing that Josephus is doing. I'm an actor in the play, but yet he does not say, I, John. Notice that. He didn't do that. He did not say, I, John. He's talking about the disciple, the term that he used, the beloved disciple, the disciple whom Jesus loved. The disciple is testifying. He is giving account and credibility to these events as an eyewitness and writing them down. Now, he could have been using an amanuensis and a scribe, but either way, he is testifying of what he's seen, but maintaining the fact that the narrative is not about him. This is exactly how they were writing at that time. So using Burskog's term of direct autopsy, What are some areas of direct autopsy in John's gospel? Let's look at number one. John shared intimate times with Jesus that was separate from the others being the other disciples. This is seen with him laying on Jesus's breast. And this is common there too. John 13 is probably the most popular story of where this is seen in the most intimate way, where John was nearest to Jesus. And I'm going to read these verses for us today in John chapter 13, in verse number 23. It says, the disciples started looking at another, uncertain as to which one he was speaking about, because Jesus is pretty much saying, somebody's about to betray me. And one of his disciples, the one Jesus loved, was reclining close beside Jesus. Simon Peter motioned to him to find out whether he was talking about him. And he leaned back to Jesus and said, Lord, who is it? Jesus replied, it is he who I give a piece of bread and after I have dipped it. Now, what we're seeing here is that the position that you see John the Apostle at is he's commonly seen as nearness to Christ. He is close by, very close, and he does not leave Christ's side. Even while Christ is hanging on a cross, he maintains closeness to Jesus. So when we're talking about this direct autopsy, is he really an insider? Is he somebody who is able to write from the perspective of, I am somebody who knows what I'm saying because I'm on the inside watching this take place? Well, there is a guy who is probably more qualified than most, and that would be John, because he was the nearest to Jesus. He was also in the inner three with his brother James and Peter. Here's another area in where he was a part of this direct autopsy. John was faithful to remain with Jesus at the cross when others did not. So he was nearest to Jesus more than others. But he was also maintaining that nearest, as I just said, that nearness to Jesus while he was on the cross. And if you look at John chapter 19, where are the other disciples? Hiding. They're hiding. Where's John? At the foot of the cross with Jesus's mother, and he's there. At that point, he didn't care what was going to happen to him. He wasn't worried about losing his life or being associated with him. He sat there comforting a mother who watched her son die on a cross. That is exactly where John was. He was able to attest to things that Peter was not there for. He was there to attest, and he did, by the way. We'll talk about in a second. He was there to attest to things that none of the other apostles could have seen with their own eyes or heard with their own ears because they were not there. He would have been a primary sourced witness who is completely qualified to write about the ministry of Jesus. He was close to Jesus. He was near to him physically in his ministry, and he remained close to him even during his death. Also, another point of intimacy that we see here in this direct autopsy is John takes Mary, the mother of Jesus, into his own home. Jesus entrusted his mother not with his half-brother James or Jude, but rather with John. This is incredible. Now, remember, at that point, Jesus's brothers appeared not to have believed in him, and they believed in him after the resurrection. But Jesus thought so highly of John, or held his credibility so great, he entrusted his own mother to the care and watchful eye of the Apostle John. So not only does John have inside information because of his nearness to Jesus, him being visibly there when Jesus is being crucified and Jesus teaching and preaching, but rather he was able to be around the mother who bore him, the mother who trained him, the mother who raised him, and the mother who saw him from a very intimate perspective. It is this same writer who is claiming at the end of the book to be the one who is entrusted with Jesus's own mother. So when we're talking about this direct autopsy, these are illustrations within the writing where we see his qualification and his ability to be consistent. John is also given the great privilege of honor with Jesus, more so than Peter. Now, this is at the end of the writing where Peter is told, yep, you'll die for me. And he tells Peter in which way he would die. But that's not the only thing that we see in this text. John gets an extension and an extended statement made about him that goes beyond the lifetime of Peter, which is why I believe John was written after the destruction of 70 AD. Peter would have been killed somewhere around 68. And I believe John wrote after the fact. And if you missed that last week as well, showing these protective anonymities that were given to people like Lazarus and Mary and Peter and Malchus, Go back to last week's session and you'll see those illustrations that I'm giving you. But he had a greater privilege of honor with Jesus than Peter himself, if not for the other reasons I just showed you. But just in chapter 21 alone, he's given a great privilege given by Jesus at the end of the narrative. Baca makes this argument about Peter and John. He makes the argument that Peter and John represent two types of discipleship. Now, let me just go ahead and make it clear so that I'm not misunderstood. I am not saying by any stretch of the imagination that Peter is inferior, nor is Bacchum for that matter. We're not saying that Peter is inferior and his testimony is inferior. We're saying that John was just that close and that he has got a whole different worldview on his side than Peter did, which is great because now we have a fuller picture of the life and ministry of Jesus. It's not that they're building and expanding on each other. You have two different eyewitnesses who are giving account to these things. But I like what Bacchum says about this, that there are two types of disciples that Peter and John represent: the active serving disciple and the perceptive witness. So you have the active service and the perceptive witness. Peter being the active one who was following Jesus. I mean, he was so passionate about Jesus. He ran up and he was volunteering. He would run his mouth so badly, get his foot stuck into it. I mean, he would sit there and say, "I'll die for you." And Jesus said, "No, you're going to deny me 3 times." And he was zealous to serve Christ. He was active in his service of Christ. He was so worried about Jesus being carried off. He's the one that picked up a sword and hacked off Malchus's ear with it. I mean, he was zealous for Jesus. There's no doubt about it. And sometimes it took him to a point of failure, but always brought him back to restoration. But on the other hand, you have John, who is a faithful listener and student throughout the whole thing. John was more quiet. Even in the synoptic accounts, he's not presented as one of the talking. Even in Acts, when he's with Peter, you have Peter and John going into the temple, both in Acts 2 and also in Acts 3. And what do you see with those two? It's amazing. It says, "And they said to the people," and then it quotes Peter. and then it would say, "They talked to the man at the gate beautiful." It says, "And they said to him," but it's Peter. John's not even given the talking point. And to me, it's like, well, man, I'm ripped off over here. John obviously said as much as Peter did, but Peter's the one that got recorded. Now, that's very likely because Luke spent more time with Peter and got the information from him. But it's interesting that even in their two existences, being together in a place like even in Acts, Peter is the active one. And John is an observer. He's a listener. He's a learner. He's faithful. He's faithful to Jesus at the table where he's leaning on his breast. He's faithful to Jesus at the cross, faithful to the point where he's trusted with Jesus' mother. I mean, this is incredible. But they represent two types of disciples. And you need both. And Jesus obviously chose different personalities on purpose. And those personalities were able to tell the story differently. It's not that Peter is lesser than John, but that God's grace is able to restore a man and use him as a great shepherd of the church, which Peter was. Whereas John's role was going to be a longer and futuristic, far more futuristic than what Peter had, or even James, his brother. His brother was the first apostle martyred. And then Peter was martyred right after Paul. And John was able to maintain longer life. Some put him in his 80s and 90s and some past that. He lived a long life making disciples and making more disciples all the way to the very end, training men like Polycarp, training men like Papias that continued to build a heritage and a history for us so that we can read words from Papias and read words from Polycarp who influenced people like Irenaeus. We are able to stand today and read much of the early church's history because the Lord allowed John to maintain his life and develop other disciples many years after Peter lived. This could be why John expressed Peter's death in comparison to what his own would look like at the very end when Jesus was speaking of Peter's death. So there's 4 ways John is portrayed in the Gospel of John as the ideal witness. And that's in addition to what we've already said. But Bacchum expresses 4 ways this took place throughout the Gospel, in addition to those that we saw as the direct autopsy. Number 1, John was able to be a follower of Jesus before Peter and longer after. as we just said. Now, that goes back to what we talked about last week with the inclusio eyewitness that you see in Mark's account for Peter and John in his own account for himself. John is the first one, not Peter. Now, it was Andrew and John, which I find extremely interesting. Andrew was the one who had it revealed to him that he should tell the story. He should be the one that teaches others of what Jesus did in an orderly fashion. It was Andrew, according to the Muratorian fragment, that pushed John to say, hey, you should write about this. It's not because Andrew's like, hey, I hate my brother and I'm glad he's rotting in a grave somewhere. You should one-up him in a gospel account. That's not what Andrew was doing. He saw a side of Jesus, and John saw a side of Jesus that Peter, Andrew's brother, did not see, and wrote about things that John could still fill out better. And that's why the early writers were talking about this being that the synoptics were writing of the bodily, whereas on the other end, John was writing on the spiritual end of this. And John was portraying the earliest stages of time, whereas Mark shows up, it's John the Baptist and Peter. But what we find in John's account, that Peter did not come to Jesus without the introduction of his own brother, and that there was an anonymous disciple that if we parallel to the end of the gospel and through the gospel, it is clearly the disciple whom Jesus loved that was with Andrew. And that would be John. And so John was with Jesus before Peter. He was there. John was at key events in the story of Jesus that Peter was not. Being in chapter 1, for example, he was there when John the Baptist introduced Jesus as the Lamb of God who would take away the sin of the world with his own blood. Chapter 1, verse 35. Later, he was able to see that same blood that was prophesied of by John the Baptist, and water flow from the very body of Jesus at the foot of the cross in chapter 19, 31 through 37. I want us to pause and just think about that. Just pause and think about the significance that Peter did not have the ability to share in that John did here. John was there when John the Baptist said, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And years later, John heard those words and at the foot of the cross saw the very blood that was prophesied of come out of the side of Jesus that Peter was not there to see. He was at key events in the story of Jesus. Another one is John's on-the-spot eyewitness report that includes more details than in other places within the account. So when John is on the spot, when he is there on the scene, when you see the disciple whom Jesus loved in the discussion, when he talks about himself in a third person, when he puts himself in there with his epithet, the disciple whom Jesus loved, when he's on the scene, the stories have more details. Let's look at some of these. I like what Tovey said. Tovey said, at every point where the beloved disciple appears, the narrative includes items of close detail which suggest on-the-spot eyewitness reports. For example, John gives the hour in which he was with Jesus, and Jesus invited him and Andrew into the location where he was staying in chapter 1, verse 39. He gives them, it was about the 10th hour. He gives detail that is significant much more than the rest of the book, because John's gospel is more about the application spiritually of Jesus' teaching and ministry. But at times when the beloved disciple is on the scene, all of a sudden extra details come into place. And that's what Tavi is saying, that when he's on the scene, details seem to be more often. For example, the time he was invited with Jesus. Also, Jesus dipping a piece of bread and giving it to Judas in chapter 13, 26. He took time to express, and naturally, he was laying on the breast of Jesus on one side, and Judas was on the other side. He would have seen that and paid attention to that more than anybody because he was sitting right there. The other disciples did not include this, or this was not included in the details as much as what John gave when he was on the scene and he saw it with his own eyes. A third one, and the details of the two different scenes of the fire that Peter was behind and warming his hands in chapter 18, which if you compare that with Mark 14:54, you'll see differences. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that scene includes Peter, but not if the disciple that's off unnamed is John. In chapter 18 of John's gospel, while Peter's there warming his hands, earlier in the text, it states clearly that there was another disciple. And since the others left, and John's the only one that remained all the way up to the trial and to the very cross itself, it's pretty clear who it was. It says Simon Peter was following Jesus with another disciple. That disciple was an acquaintance of the high priest, so he went into Jesus in the high priest's courtyard. So he went in with Jesus, and it would obviously be John because it carried it out even to the cross while the others scattered and ran away. And if that truly is John, he was able to see things at the fire scene of Peter and how he warmed his hands and heard even Malchus's relative say, "No, I saw you in the garden." And then if you compare that with Mark, it's far more in depth. And then when you go to chapter 21, verse 9, you have John the apostle there recording that Peter was around that fire of coals. And it's similar and it's paralleled, and it's clear that John the apostle was making the point that what happened in chapter 18 was being reminisced a little bit and brought up to remind Peter in chapter 21 what Jesus was trying to teach him something from his denial to his restoration. And John pointed that out, and he could because he could give the details because he was at both fire scenes. Also, a fourth one, the observation of Jesus's legs not being broken, but rather blood and water flowing from his side after being stabbed. That's in chapter 19, verse 33 through 35. He is one of the few that records these events at the cross because he was there. And he saw this as a fulfillment that not a bone would be broken. He was able to testify of that with his own eyes. And if there's one guy that should be able to testify that accurately and that we want to depend on, it would be the disciple at the cross. And that was John. But again, he gives details that the others do not. When he is on the scene, there's details given about, and there's others, especially scenes of the cross. There are others like this. We just don't have time to go through them, but these are highlights with the direct autopsy and also him being this portrayed as an ideal witness. You see when he's on the scene, more stuff is happening. Here's another one real quick. Linen wrappings folded in its place at the end of where Jesus had laid. He's the only one who was inquisitive enough and interested enough to figure out what the significance of the cloth being laid where Jesus had been folded on the very end. He's the only one who had the audacity to tell us about that. He was there. Remember, 2 disciples outside of the women ran to the tomb. He was the first one there, and then Peter caught up with him. And when he had gone there, he'd seen an empty tomb, and that's what he took note of. He gives details because he was on the scene. It's consistent all through. Another example, John giving the exact number of fish that were caught in chapter 21, verse 10 through 12. Now, remember, John's a fisherman. He would have been very interested in the idea of how many you catch, because how many you catch dictates how much you get paid. And so they would count fish. Obviously, he was one of the designated fish counters because he remembered the number. And isn't it interesting that he didn't say about 150? He didn't say that. Or about 160. Or a little over 100. He gave a crazy number. So you have 153. It's either random and just ridiculously made up, or the guy was there and he was one of the counters who counted the fish. And he remembered the number being 153 fish. But do you see the detail coming out when he is on the scene? Very different from the rest of the gospel accounts. The fourth way John is portrayed as an ideal witness is he's portrayed as the perceptive witness. Peter has eyewitness testimony of an empty tomb, just as John does. And John even has no problem telling you, Peter was there. He saw the empty tomb, like in John 28, 8 through 9. But John was able to perceive the significance and meaning of the point more so than Peter because he was able to come to believe it. He was the first one to believe it of the male disciples. Quicker than Peter. And Peter's usually pretty quick to believe, but it's like John had been seeing all this and studying this. He was at the cross. He heard Jesus's words and he was remembering things. He gets to the tomb. He sees a folded cloth. He's like, well, that's significant. That's significant to Jewish tradition. And he's putting 2 and 2 together and he believed. He didn't fully understand it all, but he believed. The others weren't given that description just yet. They are not at odds with one another, being Peter and John, but they will tell their story from their own viewpoint, and we want them to. Mark portrays Peter as a disciple who loved Jesus Mark shows that Peter was passionate and zealous about loving Jesus. And there should be an emphasis on that. But it's interesting, it's reversed in John's gospel. John portrays the disciple whom he loved himself as the disciple that, once I just said, Jesus loved. Peter is portrayed as loving Jesus. John is portrayed as Jesus loving John. It doesn't mean that John didn't love Jesus, and it doesn't mean that Jesus didn't love Peter. That's not what's being said here. But that is the intimacy factor that John had as the ideal witness. He is the guy who is qualified to write about Jesus. He knew him on a very personal level. Again, when you let somebody take care of your mother, you have high qualities and wonderful, faithful qualities, and you must have a reputation that precedes itself, because not many people will just trust anybody with their mother after they die. And John is portrayed as the disciple who Jesus loved, and the gospel account places a high emphasis on that. So when we're looking at these things, these are indicators, once more, that John is an ideal witness, and there are evidences left within the text showing us that he was indeed a writer and that he was there on the spot. And if it's not John, then who is it? And what a wonderful forgery this is otherwise. Brilliantly done and magnificent, far beyond any of the Gnostic texts we have, far beyond the Gospel of Peter. This is beyond that level of mistake. This man would have been the most brilliant forgery, written the most brilliant forgery that has been existed about the life and ministry of Jesus. Or he is so accurate because he was there and he saw it and he wrote about it. And there's much external evidence showing that it was John. All the church fathers said he was the fourth writer. And then there's internal evidence like this. Again, it doesn't automatically, well, that's it, proves it. But these are massive indicators internally of these texts that the writer was an eyewitness, and particularly giving himself away, giving himself an epithet as the beloved disciple, and showing himself in the third person, keeping consistent with the writings of his time. That's what we see in these texts of Scripture. That's what we're seeing in John's gospel. It's amazing when we just take the time and stop excusing things away and actually look at both external and internal, how consistent and how much they harmonize with one another. It's a beautiful thing to see. All right. Let's take some questions and then we'll go into a break for next week. Also, don't forget, and I'm going to put it up here, please consider becoming a Patreon. If you give a minimum of $10, you will receive my study notes for all of these sessions that we have done on the Gospels. If you do $15 a month, you will get not only the notes, but private monthly meetings with me after one of our shows. And we will allow more discussion and questions and time, and we'll even bring other of the apologists in for that. Let's see if we have anything in the chats. Once again, it's nice to see good conversation taking place and everybody's being peaceable with one another. Eric says, Explain International, do we see this same writing style in any of Polycarp's writings? Not so much with Polycarp. Now, Polycarp would have been writing differently because remember, we only have one epistle of Polycarp, and it's very possible and likely that he produced more than one. He was obviously trusted. Ignatius trusted Polycarp to distribute his letters that he wrote while on his way to be executed, and even wrote a little short letter to Polycarp himself. But what we have of Polycarp, and I'm looking forward to getting to him. It'll be a while, but I'm looking forward to getting to him. I did quite a bit of study on his letter to the Philippians. And one of the things that we see in there is that he wrote similar to not really John, but actually a lot more like Paul. And he quoted a lot of Paul. And so Polycarp was more of the epistle writer than a biographical writer. Now, Irenaeus, who was trained by John, would have been a phenomenal writer for biographies in comparison. But what we know of Polycarp is very little. And again, to compile that entire epistle alone, we have to bring in some of the statements of Eusebius, a Latin version, and the Greek text that we have that survived in its fragment, and really bring all that together to even finalize or come up with a complete account. And some would even say it's more than one. It could be two separate. I think that bringing all that together actually creates one account. But it seems like Polycarp's consistency of writing in that letter alone is a lot more like Paul very Pauline. So which means he was influenced a lot by Paul's writings. But again, he wasn't writing a biography. Now, you could say that it's similar in some ways to First John's way of writing when John wrote an epistle, but he seems to be more consistent with Paul. Let's see here. Can Stephen send me those sources for my blog? You are an apprentice. You can have any source you want for free. How about that? Let's go through some of these, couple of these others. Wayne left a little statement here. So profound. Appreciate the feedback there. And people are trying to figure out if they know each other. But yes, Slam, thank you for putting that up. Slam RN, like, and share. Make sure you like our videos. If you're enjoying these and they're helping you or they're giving you something to think about, we ask that you would share that on your social media pages or share it with friends, send it in a text form. And just get the word out. And if you're enjoying it, share it with others that you think would enjoy it as well. The more you share it, the broader we can reach people. We really do appreciate many of the responses we do receive from you as listeners. The emails come in weekly with just tremendous and kind words, some really good thoughts. And hey, did you ever know about this? Or hey, have you read that? I enjoy those emails as well. So make sure you are sharing this and getting it out there. Like us and follow us. Like us on Facebook and as well as on YouTube. And follow our blogs and our writings on our website on explaininternational.com. We have now 12 apprentices writing on various things. We just added a few more in the last few weeks, which we're really excited about. And we have various debates taking place in our group and amongst our guys and girls. And we're excited about what they're doing, the work they are producing. So please, let's bring out these videos and share them and distribute them across the internet. And that way we can reach and effectively really connect with other people and use it for the glory of Christ and the gospel, because that's what we want to do. At the end of the day, we want to honor Christ, honor his word, and honor those who he entrusted with it to write it, like the apostles. Eric, what sources do we have on the age of John before his death? You're fired for not knowing that, because if you listen to last week's session, which I think you're catching up, I think you're probably still on the second episode of Luke. One of those actually talks about that, which I will share with you after the episode is over. But you're fired for not knowing that. And if you're supposed to be an apprentice of mine, you should know my material and study notes better than I do. I'm just kidding. Eric's a good writer, by the way, and he's going to do a tremendous job getting ready for a debate with Jonathan Sheffield on Mormonism. And Eric is actually somebody who was converted out of the Mormon faith. And he wrote an article, a blog recently. If you have not read that, on the baptism of the dead, what does that mean? The Mormon church talks about when we're looking at Paul talking about it. What did Paul actually mean when he said baptizing for the dead? So check out Eric's article on that. And he's producing others. I'm really excited. We had lunch the other day talking about some of his part 1, part 2 he's going to produce. So he is a believer in Christ, converted out of Mormonism. We're excited for him to be a part of the team. Check his stuff out. He'll also be doing a debate soon with Jonathan Sheffield. Here, Tyler, Explain International. Do you see the similar objections by Muslims regarding the anonymity of the New Testament? What is a faithful way to present the authority of the church in their usage of these letters? The objection in the debates I've done against the Muslims, their objection, they don't really get into the anonymity. They just follow actually the lingo. And maybe you can attest to this too, because you have debated and discussed many doctrines and theology with the Muslims, being that you are converted out of that yourself. But the ones that I have engaged with, they don't even get into the details of the Gospels themselves. Now they're getting better, and I've noticed that they're actually working harder at that. But they mostly excuse it from a historical perspective, which is extremely interesting to me, because they quote a lot of Bart Ehrman or Robert Price or Dr. Carrier, which, by the way, when I did a session with Dr. Robert Price, I really enjoyed him. He was nothing but kind to me and very, Very appreciative of his attitude in our dialogue. We talked about the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Thomas. You can find that actually on the YouTube channel. It's been over a year now, but Dr. Price was phenomenal at that. But they like quoting him for the dating of the Gospels from his book, The Pre-Nicene Fathers. Another one is Dr. Carrier, which I've done a couple of episodes with now. We did one on Daniel together. And Dr. Carrier places things much later. John's almost at the end of the 2nd century. But it's interesting, they use those arguments from the external perspective. They really do not get into the main details of the text like we're talking about in the anonymity. Now, maybe I'm misunderstanding your question, but maybe you've also engaged this from a different perspective where they're getting into more details. But the ones that I've done publicly, the debates I've done, even when I debated Nassam, it was a little less than a year ago now. Nassam did not get into the details of the interior text, although he mentioned a few passages where he thought that they were not agreeing with each other. They contradicted each other, where I felt like he was misunderstanding the writer's perspective, which are some of the areas that we've covered in these sessions themselves. But he had no internal argument to go into those discussions dealing with anonymity like we see here. So the second question you have here is, what is a faithful way to present the authority of the church and their usage of these letters? That is where we have to go, Tyler. That is the point, because, and this is the thing where people really get messed up. They're like, well, the Bible, authorizes itself. It is self-authenticating. Again, it is in a way, but history shows us how authentication actually spread into the churches. If they were authorized, then there should be one of the main criteria of a canonical book that I hold to is that it must be corporately received by the churches without them coming together and conspiring. And that is exactly what we see in history. How is it that the churches in Alexandria and the churches in Syria and the churches in Rome and the churches in the East and the churches in Jerusalem were receiving the same exact 4 gospels, to the point where I love what Origen says, that under heaven, universally, the 4 gospels were undisputed amongst the churches. There was no debate about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There were debates about many other books, but not Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There was no arguments on the apostolic churches all over the place, even down into India, where Thomas had been and others. The Gospel of Matthew was already circulating out there. There was no dispute amongst the churches across the world as to which 4 gospels were authenticated by the apostles, transmitted it by those churches, and they had continually received the books. And that's why if you read the Hippo and Carthage and all the things they were putting out when they were writing, they did not say we chose these books or we accepted these books. They said these were the ones that were handed down to us. They were undisputed. So a faithful way to present the authority of the churches is to go through history and show, then why is it that these writers like Clement and Polycarp and Ignatius and Irenaeus and Tertullian are quoting the same 4 gospels? Why is it the earliest transmission of the Didache at the end of the 1st century is quoting from Matthew's gospel, just like the Matthew we have, Luke's gospel, just like the Luke we have? How is that possible? How is it that Clement in the end of the 1st century is quoting numerous New Testament books, even Hebrews most often? So when we're looking at these writers, it's significant to point out the fact that the churches were not only already accepting them as apostolic, but quoting them as apostolic and using them as authoritative words to govern, lead, and instruct the churches with. That is the miracle here that needs to be discussed amongst not just the Christians, but in dialogue with the Muslim faith and others for that matter. Again, thank you for tuning in. We're wrapping it up now. Thank you for your questions. If you have any more, we'll try to follow up with you later. We hope that you have a good rest of the week and that you'll relax next Monday, take a week off. We'll be back the Monday after, jumping into, did the Nicene Fathers choose our 4 gospels? Do we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because they said so? Is that why we use these books? Or is there much, much earlier attestation than that? Thank you again for tuning in. Grace.